Welcome to the marvelous land of Oz. I'm Mardell, reading The Scarecrow of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 22, The Waterfall. Glinda's castle was a long way from the mountains, but the Scarecrow began the journey cheerfully, since time was of no great importance in the land of Oz, and he had recently made the trip and knew the way. It never mattered much to Button-Bright where he was or what he was doing. The boy was content in being alive and having good companions to share his wanderings. As for Trot and Cap'n Bill, they now found themselves so comfortable and free from danger in this fine fairyland, and they were so awed and amazed by the adventures they were encountering, that the journey to Glinda's castle was more like a pleasure trip than a hardship. So many wonderful things were there to see. Button-Bright had been in Oz before, but never in this part of it, so the Scarecrow was the only one who knew the paths and could lead them. They had eaten a hearty breakfast, which they found already prepared for them, and awaiting them on the table when they arose from their refreshing sleep. So they left the magic house in a contented mood, and with hearts lighter and more happy than they had known for many a day. As they marched along through the fields, the sun shone brightly, and the breeze was laden with delicious fragrance, for it carried with it the breath of millions of wildflowers. At noon, when they stopped to rest by the banks of a pretty river, Trot said with a long-drawn breath that was much like a sigh, "I wish we'd brought with us some of the food that was left from our breakfast, for I'm getting hungry again." Scarcely had she spoken when a table rose up before them, as if from the ground itself, and it was loaded with fruits and nuts and cakes and many other good things to eat. The little girl's eyes opened wide at this display of magic, and Cap'n Bill was not sure that the things were actually there and fit to eat until he had taken them in his hand and tasted them. But the Scarecrow said with a laugh, "Someone is looking after your welfare, that is certain. And from the looks of this table, I suspect my friend the wizard has taken us in his charge. I've known him to do things like this before, and if we are in the wizard's care, you need not worry about your future." "Who's worrying?" inquired Button-Bright, already at the table and busily eating. The Scarecrow looked around the place while the others were feasting, and finding many things unfamiliar to him, he shook his head and remarked, "I must have taken the wrong path back in that last valley, for on my way to Jinxland I remember that I passed around the foot of this river, where there was a great waterfall." "Did the river make a bend after the waterfall?" asked Cap'n Bill. "No, the river disappeared. Only a pool of whirling water showed what had become of the river, but I suppose it is underground somewhere and will come to the surface again in another part of the country." "Well," suggested Trot as she finished her luncheon, "as there is no way to cross this river, I suppose we'll have to go find that waterfall and go around it." "Exactly," replied the Scarecrow, so they soon renewed their journey, following the river for a long time, until the roar of the waterfall sounded in their ears. By and by they came to the waterfall itself, a sheet of silver dropping far, far down into a tiny lake, which seemed to have no outlet. From the top of the fall where they stood, the banks gradually sloped away, so that the descent by land was quite easy, while the river could do nothing but glide over an edge of rock and tumble straight down to the depths below. "You see," said the Scarecrow, leaning over the brink, "this is called by our Oz people the Great Waterfall, because it is certainly the highest one in all the land, but I think—" "Help!" He had lost his balance and pitched head foremost into the river. They saw a flash of straw and blue clothes, and the painted face looking upward in surprise. The next moment the Scarecrow was swept over the waterfall and plunged into the basin below. The accident had happened so suddenly that for a moment they were all too horrified to speak or move. "Quick, we must go to help him, or he will be drowned," Trot exclaimed. Even while speaking, she began to descend the bank to the pool below, and Cap'n Bill followed as swiftly as his wooden leg would let him. Button-Bright came more slowly, calling to the girl. "He can't drown Trot, he's a scarecrow." But she wasn't sure a scarecrow couldn't drown, and never relaxed her speed until she stood on the edge of the pool, with the spray dashing in her face. Cap'n Bill, puffing and panting, had just voice enough to ask as he reached her side, "See him, Trot?" "Not a speck of him. Oh, Cap'n, what do you suppose has become of him?" "I suppose," replied the sailor, "that he's in that water more or less far down, and I'm afraid it'll make his straw pretty soggy. But as for his being drowned, I agree with Button-Bright that it can't be done." There was small comfort in this assurance, and Trot stood for some time, searching with her eyes the bubbling water, in the hope that the Scarecrow would finally come to the surface. Presently she heard Button-Bright calling, "Come here, Trot," and looking around, she saw that the boy had crept over the wet rocks to the edge of the waterfall and seemed to be peering behind it. Making her way toward him, she asked, "What do you see?" "A cave," he answered. "Let's go in. Perhaps we'll find the Scarecrow there." She was a little doubtful of that, but the cave interested her, and so did it Cap'n Bill. There was just space enough at the edge of the sheet of water for them to crowd in behind it. But after that dangerous entrance, they found room enough to walk upright, and after a time they came to an opening in the wall of rock. Approaching this opening, they gazed within it and found a series of steps, cut so that they might easily descend into the cavern. Trot turned to look inquiringly at her companions. The falling water made such din and roaring that her voice could not be heard. Cap'n Bill nodded his head, but before he could enter the cave, Button-Bright was before him, clambering down the steps without a particle of fear, so the others followed the boy. The first steps were wet with spray and slippery, but the remainder were quite dry. A rosy light seemed to come from the interior of the cave, and this lighted their way. After the steps there was a short tunnel, high enough for them to walk erect in, and then they reached the cave itself, and paused in wonder and admiration. They stood on the edge of a vast cavern, the walls and domed roof of which were lined with countless rubies exquisitely cut and flashing sparkling rays from one to another. This caused a radiant light that permitted the entire cavern to be distinctly seen, and the effect was so marvelous that Trot drew in her breath with a sort of gasp and stood quite still in wonder. But the walls and roof of the cavern were merely a setting for a more wonderful scene. In the center was a bubbling cauldron of water, for here the river rose again, splashing and dashing, till its spray rose high in the air, where it took the ruby color of the jewels, and seemed like a seething mass of flame. And while they gazed into the tumbling, tossing water, the body of the Scarecrow suddenly rose in the center, struggling and kicking, and the next instant wholly disappeared from view. "My, but he's wet!" exclaimed Button-Bright, but none of the others heard him. Trot and Cap'n Bill discovered that a broad ledge, covered like the walls with glittering rubies, ran all around the cavern, So they followed this gorgeous path to the rear and found where the water made its final dive underground before it disappeared entirely. Where it plunged into this dim abyss, the river was black and dreary looking, and they stood gazing in awe until just beside them the body of the Scarecrow again popped up from the water. Please join me next time for more exciting adventure with Trot and Cap'n Bill in The Scarecrow of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Goodbye for now. See you in Oz.